The jungle heat on Cape Gloucester was a physical weight, pressing down with a wet, rotting insistence. Captain John Jack Corbin wiped sweat from his brow with a sleeve already stained dark, his eyes scanning the captured Japanese airfield. Around him, the Marines of the 1st Division moved with the weary efficiency of men who had just taken a place and were now trying to understand what they had won. The prize was a mess of churned mud, shattered aircraft, and the lingering stink of cordite and decay. As an intelligence officer, Jack's war had mostly been one of paper and radio intercepts. Here, it was visceral. He picked his way past the burnt-out husk of a Zero, its cockpit a blackened scar. His task was to document anything of value, but so far, it was a catalogue of destruction, nothing but junk. "Captain," a grimy corporal called out, kicking the tire of a destroyed bomber. "They wrecked anything that wouldn't fly." Jack nodded, a familiar frustration settling in. Then, something caught his eye. A flicker of unnatural symmetry in the chaotic green wall of jungle at the airfield's edge. He moved closer, pushing aside a broad, wet leaf, and there it was. It was a Kawasaki Ki 61, canted slightly in the soft earth, but whole. Astonishingly whole. It had been hidden with a craftsman's care, palm fronds and cut vegetation woven into a canopy over its wings and fuselage. Two bold white bands encircled the mid-fuselage, marks of a command aircraft. On the left side of the cockpit, a faded but defiant eagle insignia was painted. This was no abandoned junker, this was a placed asset, a secret held by the Earth. "My God," Jack whispered. "It's a ghost." He circled the aircraft, his mind racing. This was the fighter they called Tony. A rare breed. Most captured Japanese planes were light, nimble, radial engine types. This one, with its liquid-cooled engine and sleek lines, was different. It was a sniper's rifle to the Zero's samurai sword that he called for help, and soon a team of Marines was carefully clearing the foliage. Jack approached the cockpit. The canopy was locked. Using a bayonet, he pried it open, the metal protesting with a sharp squeal. The interior smelled of oil, stale air, and something else, the faint, personal scent of its former occupant. His fingers traced the instruments, all intact. Then, tucked into a narrow space behind the control panel, his touch found something soft. He carefully pulled it out. It was a senenbari, a 1,000-stitch belt. A strip of white cloth covered in a dense tapestry of red stitches, each one supposedly sewn by a different woman for good luck. It was an intensely personal object, a token of home and hope. Holding it, the anonymous enemy pilot ceased to be a concept. He became a man. A man who had flown this machine, who had trusted this charm to bring him home, and who had, in the end, left both behind. The intelligence machinery word to life. The plane, manufacturer number 263, was a treasure trove. As mechanics and technicians arrived to prepare it for shipment to Australia, Jack buried himself in the scraps of evidence. He found maintenance logs, partially burned, complaining of high oil consumption and erratic magnetos. He deciphered the unit markings, the 68th Sentai, 2nd Chutai. This was the commander's plane that he began to build a profile. The pilot was skilled, experienced. He had flown this complex, temperamental machine for months. He had cared for it. And on December 26, 1943, when the order came to evacuate all serviceable aircraft, this one had refused to start. The decision its pilot faced was stark: stay and die with his plane, or leave a piece of himself behind. Jack named it. In his reports and in his mind, it became the Ghost of Gloucester. It was a phantom of the past, a perfectly preserved relic of a retreating enemy. He requested to be part of the technical team that would accompany the disassembled fighter to Eagle Farm Airfield in Australia. He needed to know its secrets, but the war had other plans. Before the crate could be loaded onto a transport ship, new orders came. The intelligence section of the 1st Marine Division was being reassigned. They were going to a place that had become a byword for hell itself, Guadalcanal. The campaign was officially over, but the island was a festering wound, still needing garrison troops and specialist units. Jack folded the Senninbari and placed it in his pocket. He took one last look at the crate containing the Ghost, then turned and boarded a different ship, heading east into the heart of the Pacific Storm. His war of paper was over. The Ghost of Gloucester had receded into the mist, but its echo was waiting for him. He was sailing toward the very crucible where that aircraft and its pilot had earned their scars. He was going to meet the Ghost on its own ground. The journey was a nightmare of heat, crowding, and anticipation. When the green, mountainous spine of Guadalcanal finally appeared on the horizon, it looked less like an island and more like a crouching beast. The air, as they disembarked, was thick with the smell of mud, rotting vegetation, and spent explosives. Henderson Field was a scar of dirt and Marston matting, surrounded by a perimeter of ragged tents and fortified positions. Jack was assigned to a dugout near the airfield, his task to analyze intercepted signals and interrogate the occasional, rare prisoner. It was here he met Sergeant Miles Mac McCready. Mac was a raider, a veteran of the Tulagi Landing, a man whose face seemed carved from teak and whose eyes held the flat, assessing look of a predator. He had a shrapnel scar on his forearm and a deep-seated contempt for anyone who hadn't been in the shit. "So you're the brain," Mac said by way of greeting, not looking up from cleaning his rifle. "They told me to keep you alive. Try not to do anything stupid, like think too hard when the shooting starts." The first night, the Ghost returned. Not the plane, but its specter. The air raid siren wailed, a sound that tore at the nerves. The sky was filled with the crump of anti-aircraft fire and the drone of Japanese bombers, washing machine Charlies. But then, a different, sharper engine note cut through the chaos. Jack, huddled in a trench beside a silently fuming Mac, looked up. Silhouetted against the searchlights and the flashes of explosions was a fighter. It was faster, sleeker than the others. It made a single, slashing pass, its guns winking, before diving away and vanishing into the darkness. It was a Tony. A key-61.in. That moment, the intellectual puzzle became terrifyingly real. The Ghost wasn't just a relic he had found. It was a weapon. The man who had flown the plane in his mind was out there, or men like him, in machines just like it. The war was no longer a matter of documents and captured artifacts. It was here, now, screaming out of the sky that he clutched the Senninbari in his pocket. He was no longer just hunting the story of a ghost. He was living in its world. The slashing attack of the Tony fighter in the night sky over Henderson Field changed everything for Jack Corbin. The Ghost was no longer a memory from Cape Gloucester, it was a living, breathing threat. The intellectual puzzle had become a matter of survival. Sergeant McCready saw the change in him. The captain was jumpier, his eyes constantly scanning the sky. "It's just a plane, Professor," Mac grunted one morning, as they shared a cup of bitter, mud-like coffee. "They all shoot at you." "It's not just a plane," Jack insisted, his voice low. "It's fast. It dives differently. Our pilots don't know how to fight it." He threw himself into his work with a new, desperate intensity. He used his authority to request the initial technical reports from Australia on the captured Key-61. When the documents arrived, they were a revelation. He learned about the Tony's weaknesses, its poor low-speed handling, its tendency to stall viciously if pushed into a turning fight it couldn't win, the vulnerability of its wing-mounted radiators. That he started briefing the weary, skeptical Marine and Navy pilots at Henderson Field. He stood before them with chalkboard diagrams, a scholar trying to teach survival to warriors. "Don't try to turn with it," he'd explain, pointing to the sketch of the key, 61. "It will outrun and outdive you. Let it make its pass. Let it commit. Then, when it's slow at the top of its climb, that's your moment. That's when it's a sitting duck." Some pilots listened. Others dismissed him as a desk jockey. But a few days later, a young wildcat pilot named Lieutenant Miller sought him out. "That Tony profile you gave us," the pilot said, his face smudged with oil and exhaustion. "It worked. I let him overshoot, got on his tail. He couldn't shake me. You saved my neck, Captain." It was the first victory Jack had ever been a part of that wasn't on paper. He had used the ghost's own secrets to fight back. Mac, who had been leaning against the doorway listening, gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was the first sign of respect Jack had seen from him. The war on the ground was a relentless grind of mud, malaria, and misery. Jack's obsession with the 68 Sentai became his anchor. He pieced together more of Takeuchi's story from a captured diary, its pages stained with tropical mold. He read the pilot's frustrations with the failing engines, his grief for lost comrades, his grim determination. He wasn't a fanatical monster, he was a soldier, doing his duty as his world collapsed. One afternoon, a coded message was deciphered. It was a routine Imperial Japanese Army dispatch from late 1943, listing officer casualties. Jack's blood ran cold as he translated the name, Captain Shogo Takeuchi. Killed in action, December 21, 1943, over New Guinea. 5 days. He had died 5 days before he abandoned his plane at Cape Gloucester. The realization struck Jack like a physical blow. The pilot had never made the decision to leave his aircraft. He was already dead. The ghost of Gloucester had been just that, a phantom, a machine without its master, left behind by a retreating ground crew following the last order of a man already gone. The haunting became personal. He wasn't just studying an enemy, he was chasing the ghost of a specific man, a man whose war had ended just as Jack's was beginning in earnest. A week later, Mac's squad, with Jack in tow, was sent on a patrol to investigate reports of a Japanese radio unit operating near the Mataniko River. The jungle was a claustrophobic green tunnel. They walked into an ambush, the world exploded in a storm of rifle fire and the distinctive tat-tat-tat of a Nambu light machine gun. Marines dove for cover. Jack froze, the theoretical world of intelligence collapsing into the very real, very close impact of bullets snapping past his head. "Get down, you idiot!" Mac roared, yanking him behind a thick tree trunk. The sergeant moved with a brutal economy, returning fire, directing his men. A Japanese soldier, screaming a battle cry, broke from cover and charged their position, bayonet fixed. Jack stared, paralyzed. Mac swung his rifle up, but a burst of enemy fire forced him back down. The soldier was 10 feet away, 5. There was a sharp crack. The soldier crumpled. A Marine sniper in a tree behind them had found his mark. The firefight sputtered and died as the remaining Japanese melted back into the jungle. The silence that followed was deafening. Mac got to his feet, his face a mask of cold anger. He didn't say a word to Jack. He just walked over to the dead soldier and began searching his pack. He pulled out a small, oilcloth pouch and tossed it to Jack. "Intel," he said, his voice flat. Jack's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were a few personal letters and a photograph of a young woman. And there, on a piece of official unit stationery, was a letter. The heading was smudged, but clear enough, 68 Sentai. His breath caught in his throat. It was a letter from one pilot to another, a comrade of Takeuchi's. He was reading the words of a man who might have known his ghost that in that moment, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and blood, holding the personal effects of a dead man connected to the ghost of another. The two sides of the war collapsed into one terrible, human tragedy. He was no longer an observer. He was a part of the same story. The ambush at the Matanicoa River changed Jack Corbin. The paralyzing fear was still there, but it was now housed in a shell of hardened resolve. He had looked into the face of the war and it had a human countenance, both the dead soldier at his feet and the ghostly image of Captain Takeuchi in his mind. Sergeant McCready saw the shift. The professor was gone, replaced by a quieter, more focused man. The respect between them was now unspoken, but real. Back at the perimeter, Jack devoured the letter from the dead soldier's pack. It was filled with the mundane details of a soldier's life, complaints about the food, worries about family, a shared joke about a faulty engine. But one line struck him like a lightning bolt. The writer mentioned Takeuchi's final mission, an escort run for bombers to Ural. He wrote of Takeuchi's plane, his beloved Swallow, being caught in a storm of American lightnings. The description was brief, clinical, and final. It confirmed everything. Takeuchi had died in a fierce, fair fight, a world away from the silent, mechanical failure that grounded his plane. Jack now held the entire story. The beginning, the middle, and the end. The ghost of Gloucester was no longer a mystery, but a closed loop. A life, a death, and a machine that outlived them both. He threw himself into the war effort with a new purpose. His briefings to the pilots became more confident, more tactical. He wasn't just relaying data, he was telling them the story of a specific aircraft's weaknesses, and they were listening. He and Mac fell into a rhythm, the brain and the brawn, a strangely effective partnership. Mac handled the brutal, immediate reality of the island, while Jack pieced together the larger picture, his insight sometimes giving them a crucial edge. Weeks bled into months. The Japanese attempts to retake the island grew more desperate, then finally ceased. The battle of attrition was won. An eerie, exhausted quiet settled over Henderson Field. The air raid stopped. The Tokyo Express no longer ran. The war on Guadalcanal was over. The order came down, Jack's unit was being rotated out. As he packed his few belongings, the worn Senninbari felt heavy in his hand. It had been a talisman, a key to a puzzle. But the puzzle was solved. A final report crossed his desk before he left. It was a summary from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit. The captured Key 61, manufacturer number 263, had been tested extensively in the United States. Its performance had been charted, its secrets laid bare, its data used to save American lives. And then, on a test flight over North Carolina, its temperamental Hot 40 engine had failed catastrophically. It had crashed and was completely destroyed. Jack read the words without surprise. It felt inevitable. The ghost had finally found its rest, succumbing to the same flaw that had created it. The circle was now complete. On his last evening on the island, he walked away from the bustling camp, Mac watching his back from a distance without being asked. He went to the edge of the airfield, near the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker. The place where he had first truly understood the ghost's menace during that long-ago air raid. He knelt in the dirt. The war had taken so much, lives, innocence, peace. It had tried to take his humanity, too. But holding this thread, connecting him to Takeuchi, to the ground crew, to the men he had briefed, had somehow given a sliver of it back. This wasn't a trophy. It was a relic of a story that needed to be honored, not possessed. He used his hands to dig a small, deep hole in the rich, dark earth. He placed the Senninbari inside, this token of 1,000 hopes from a home he would never see. He covered it over, patting the soil flat. He wasn't burying a souvenir, he was laying a ghost to rest. The pilot, the plane, and the part of himself that had been obsessed with them. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. The Pacific sky was turning a brilliant, fiery orange. He turned his back on the grave and walked towards the waiting transport plane, ready to face whatever came next, the ghost of Gloucester finally silent within him. 5 years later, the office at the Naval Historical Center in Washington, D.C. was quiet, insulated from the city's noise by layers of bureaucracy and bound reports. Commander John Corbin, his uniform bearing the crispness of a stateside posting, sat at his desk. The war was over, its colossal energy now channeled into the tedious work of understanding what had happened. Before him lay a draft manuscript, Allied Technical Analysis of Japanese Aircraft, Volume 3. He was tasked with reviewing the chapter on the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien. As he read the dry, clinical prose, the HA-40 engine exhibited chronic reliability issues, the type was vulnerable in sustained turning engagements, the words felt hollow. They contained data, but no truth. He unlocked a drawer in his desk and pulled out a faded, cardboard-bound folder. His personal notes from the war. And there, tucked inside, was a photograph. Not of the pristine, captured Ki-61 at Cape Gloucester, but a grainy, blown-up image of a different wreck. It was Takeuchi's crash site in the New Guinea jungle, taken by an Australian patrol after the war. All that was left was a tangle of vines and a single, broken wing, the red Hinomaru barely visible. .2 endings for one ghost that he thought of Mac. Sergeant Miles McCready had survived the war, too. He'd gone back to Montana, and his letters, infrequent and blunt, spoke of buying land, of quiet, and of a peace that was hard-won. He never mentioned the Senenbari, or the ambush, or the briefings. He'd once written, "The ground here doesn't smell like that island. For that, I'm grateful." It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging the shared horror. Jack's final act before leaving the Pacific had been to write a letter. It was to the address he'd found for Takeuchi's family in the intelligence files, a small town in the Japanese countryside. He'd written it 12 times in his head, 100 times on paper. In the end, he kept it simple. He did not identify himself as an enemy officer. He wrote that he was an historian, and that in the course of his research, he had learned of Captain Shogo Takeuchi. He wrote that the captain was remembered as a skilled and dedicated pilot, and that his personal effects had been treated with respect. He enclosed a photograph of the Senenbari, laid upon the soil of Guadalcanal before he buried it. He did not know if the letter ever arrived, or what it meant if it did. It was a message in a bottle, sent across a sea of animosity, an attempt to return a single, human story to its rightful owners. That he closed his personal folder and returned to the official manuscript. He picked up a red pen. In the margin next to the technical specifications for the Ki-61, he did not strike anything out. Instead, he wrote a single, concise sentence, a footnote for future historians who might care to understand the full weight of the machines they studied. The value of this aircraft to the Allied war effort was not solely in its technical data, but in the story of its capture, which provided a tangible key to understanding the capabilities, and the human limitations, of our enemy. He set the pen down. The ghost was no longer his. It was part of the record now. Not just the ghost of a plane, or a pilot, but the ghost of a war that had redefined the world. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at a city at peace. The silence in the room was no longer the tense quiet of Henderson Field, waiting for the next attack. It was just silence. And for the first time, it felt like a gift. The last stand of the tin cans. The Pacific was a sheet of burnished silver under the faint light of a fading dawn. Aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, the air was heavy with a damp, salty chill. Ensign David "Davy" Crockett, just 21 years old and just 6 months out of the Naval Academy, gripped the cool metal of the bridge wing, trying to steady his stomach and his nerves. The ship, all 2,700 tons of her, cut through the swells with a rhythmic, living motion that still felt foreign to a boy from the flat, solid plains of Iowa. From his perch, he could see the rest of Taffy 3, their little task unit. A handful of escort carriers, nicknamed Jeep carriers for their small size and slow speed, plodded along at the center. They were ungainly things, little more than merchant hulls with flight decks bolted on. Surrounding them were their guardians, the other destroyers, the Hull and the Heermann, and the even smaller destroyer escorts. It felt like a quiet, floating town, a world away from the war. "See anything interesting, Mr. Crockett?" The voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together. Chief Boatswain's Mate O'Malley stood beside him, a steaming mug of coffee in his thick, scarred hands. Boats had a face tanned to the texture of old leather and eyes that had seen everything twice. "Just the ocean, Chief," Davy replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Aye, plenty of that," O'Malley said, taking a slow sip. "But it's what's under it and what's coming over it that'll ruin your day. Keep your eyes sharp." Davy nodded, feeling the chief's appraisal like a physical weight. He was the new fish, the academy graduate with a head full of theory and no practical knowledge. He knew the crew, these hardened veterans who could tie every knot blindfolded and strip a 5-inch gun in their sleep, were watching him, waiting to see if he would break. The ship's public address system crackled to life, cutting through the morning quiet. "Now hear this. All hands, give me your attention." The voice was calm, firm, and carried an undeniable authority. It was the voice of their captain, Commander Ernest Evans. The crew on deck and in the gun mounts stilled, listening. "This is the captain," Evans began. "I'm not one for long speeches. You know your jobs. You know this ship. But I want you to understand something." He paused, and the only sound was the wash of the bow wave. "They call these tin cans. They say we're the little guys. But let me tell you, this is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." A quiet settled over the Johnston, deeper than before. It wasn't a cheer or a roar of approval. It was a somber absorption of a promise. Davy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This wasn't the abstract war from the textbooks in Annapolis. This was a man looking his crew in the eye and telling them he was going to take them straight into hell. The morning watch continued. Davy tried to focus on his duties, plotting positions, checking the status boards. But the captain's words echoed in his mind. Go in harm's way, then, at 0645, the world changed. Contact. Surface contact. Bearing 350. Multiple ships. Range 30,000 yards. The voice from the radar room over the squawk box was tight, urgent. The officer of the deck grabbed his binoculars. Identify. Are they ours? The answer, when it came, was strained, disbelieving. Negative. Negative. IFF is negative. Sir, the scope is clogged with pips. It's the whole goddamn Japanese fleet. Davy rushed to the bridge wing, raising his own binoculars. At first, he saw only the horizon. Then, he saw them. Thin, distant lines against the gray sky, growing steadily. Then, the distinctive, pagoda-like superstructures. Battleships. Cruisers. A forest of masts and guns dot on the bridge, the air was sucked out by a collective, silent gasp. This was the Japanese center force. The mightiest surface fleet Japan had left. They had stumbled right into the heart of it. Commander Evans stood motionless for a second, his eyes fixed on the approaching giants. The battleship Yamato alone displaced more than the entire Taffy 3 combined. Her 9 18-inch guns could fire a shell the weight of a small car over 20 miles. They were looking at annihilation. Evans didn't hesitate. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and clear, cutting through the paralyzing fear. All engines ahead flank. Commence making smoke. Left full rudder. The orders landed on Davy like physical blows. Left full rudder. That would turn them toward the enemy. They were pointing away. They could run, try to hide in the rain squalls. Then he understood. The jeep carriers. The slow, vulnerable, priceless carriers. They were the target. The Johnston and her sisters were the only thing standing between them and slaughter. They weren't running. They were attacking. The deck lurched as the engines roared to their maximum power, the ship heeling hard into its turn. White, choking smoke began to pour from the stacks, billowing out to lay a protective screen. The Johnston, a tin can, was charging the battle line. Davy looked at the faces around him. Chief O'Malley met his gaze. There was no fear in the chief's eyes, only a grim, determined focus. He gave Davy a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. This is it, Davy thought, his academy training fleeing his mind, replaced by a cold, stark terror. This is harm's way. The world dissolved into a screaming, fire-lit chaos. The Johnston's flank speed turn pressed the crew against bulkheads, a physical manifestation of the violent new reality. Through the spreading smoke screen, the Japanese fleet became a line of flashing, orange-tongued monsters. The thunder of their main batteries was a deep, visceral punch in the chest that arrived long before the geysers of water. All guns, commence firing. Commence firing. The order was shouted, desperate and defiant. The Johnston's 5-inch guns, puny against the enemy's armament, began to bark back, a terrier yapping at a pack of wolves. The first salvo from a Japanese battleship landed 1,000 yards off the port bow. The column of water it threw up was taller than the Johnston's mast. The second salvo was 500 yards. They were walking their fire in, and the next one would be a direct hit. Ensign Davy Crockett clung to a stanchion on the bridge, his knuckles white. The roar was deafening, the concussions shaking the ship to her keel. He saw Commander Evans, a rock at the center of the storm, his face set in a mask of fierce concentration as he conned the ship, weaving an erratic, desperate course through the falling shells. They're targeting the carriers, someone yelled. Davy looked past the smoke. The Japanese gunners had shifted their aim to the slow, fleeing jeep carriers. This was their chance. This was why they had turned. Torpedo officer, stand by. Evans's voice cut through the din. We're going in close. Close. The word was a death sentence. They were charging into the heart of the enemy fleet, into the killing zone of dozens of secondary batteries. The Johnston shuddered as a shell, this one from a cruiser, screamed overhead and tore a hole in the sea off their starboard side. Shrapnel whined through the air, pinging against the superstructure. Davy flinched, ducking instinctively. He felt a hand on his shoulder, pulling him upright. It was Chief O'Malley. On your feet, Mr. Crockett, the chief bellowed, his voice barely audible. The men are watching you. You can't lead from the deck. The chief's eyes were hard, but not unkind. It was a lesson, delivered in the middle of hell. Davy nodded, swallowing his fear, and forced himself to stand straight, to look out at the enemy as if he had a right to be there. The ship leaped forward, a greyhound unleashed. They were closing the range at a terrifying speed. The Japanese ships loomed larger, no longer distant specks but immense, detailed castles of steel. Davy could see the individual gun barrels, the ant-like figures on their decks, fire torpedoes. A violent shudder ran through the Johnston as her 10 torpedoes launched one after another, splashing into the water and streaking towards the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. For a tense minute, nothing happened. Then, a brilliant orange flash bloomed amidships on the cruiser. A cheer went up on the Johnston's bridge. They had scored a hit. The Kumano, her bow mangled, began to slow and fall out of formation. It was a wound. A small one, but a wound, but the victory was fleeting. The entire Japanese line now focused its wrath on the impertinent little destroyer that had dared to sting them. The sea around the Johnston erupted. It was no longer a question of single salvos, but a continuous, churning maelstrom of shell splashes. The ship was drenched in spray, the decks running with water. A hit. A terrible, grinding crash forward. The ship lurched. Lights flickered and died, direct hit on the forward gun mount. Fire in the wardroom. The damage report started flooding the bridge. They were being torn apart. Another shell ripped into the engine room, and the relentless vibration of the flank speed engines faltered. Speed bled away. They were slowing, becoming a sitting duck. Commander Evans, blood streaming from a wound on his head from flying glass, never left his post. Keep firing. Give the carriers every second we can. Davy looked astern. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw a miraculous sight. The other destroyers of Taffy III, the Hole and the Heermann, were following their lead, also turning to attack, also charging into the storm of steel. They were not dying alone. The Johnston was a wreck. She was on fire, she was losing power, half her guns were silent, and dozens of men were dead or wounded. But for nearly 2 hours, they had held the line. They had drawn the ire of giants, and in doing so, they had given the jeep carriers a chance to run, to launch their planes, to live. As the ship slowed to a crawl, wallowing in the swells, a strange, relative quiet fell. The Japanese fire shifted away, seeking new targets. They had done all the damage they could to the crippled destroyer. Davy, covered in soot and other men's blood, leaned against the bullet-scarred bulkhead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They were still afloat. They were still alive. For now. The silence was the most terrifying sound Ensign Davy Crockett had ever heard. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of the predator circling its mortally wounded prey. The Johnston was dead in the water. Thick, black smoke poured from a gash in her side. The deck was a twisted landscape of scorched metal, severed lines, and the grim, covered forms of the fallen. The air reeked of cordite, fuel oil, and burning paint. They had done it. They had torpedoed a cruiser, drawn the fire of a fleet, and bought precious time. But the cost was the ship herself. Commander Evans, bleeding from wounds in his head and hands, still stood on his bridge, his voice a hoarse whisper as he directed the few remaining able-bodied men to jettison loose gear and fight the fires. He was a ghost commanding a ghost ship. Then, a new sound cut through the haze of pain and exhaustion, the high whine of incoming shells, smaller, faster. Japanese destroyers. The capital ships had moved on, but the enemy's screen was moving in to finish the job. All hands, brace for impact. The warning was futile. They had no way to dodge. The first shell hit with a deafening crack, amidships. The second struck the bridge. Davy was thrown from his feet, his head ringing. When his vision cleared, he saw that the front of the pilot house was gone. Commander Evans was gone. A cold, final dread seized Davy. The soul of the ship had been extinguished. Abandon ship. All hands, abandon ship. The order was passed from what was left of the officers. The Johnston was listing heavily, her decks awash. Davy stumbled down ladders, helping wounded men toward the rails. He found Chief O'Malley on the main deck, his shirt stained dark red, using his own body to support a sailor with a broken leg. "Chief! We have to go!" Davy yelled over the roar of the flames. O'Malley nodded, his face pale but calm. Together, they half-dragged, half-carried the wounded sailor to the side and slid him into the warm, oily water. Men were going over the sides all around them, dropping into the sea, grabbing onto floater nets, rafts, anything that would keep them afloat. Davy and the chief went last. The water was a shock, thick with fuel oil that coated their faces and choked their lungs. They kicked away from the sinking ship, the suction pulling at their legs. Davy turned back for one last look. The USS Johnston, her bow rising into the air, slid beneath the waves with a great hiss of steam. She was gone. The battle wasn't over. A Japanese destroyer, the Yukikes, sliced through the water, heading straight for the cluster of survivors. Davy braced for the machine gun fire, for the end. But it never came. Instead, as the destroyer passed, her captain emerged on the bridge wing. He was a sharp, clean silhouette against the sky. He raised his hand to the brim of his cap in a crisp, formal salute. Then the ship was gone, leaving only its wake. Davy stared, treading water in the vast, empty sea. He couldn't process it. It was an act of respect from a warrior to a worthy foe. It was the only honor left in this graveyard that he felt a tug on his arm. Chief O'Malley was clinging to a piece of wreckage, his breathing labored. The red stain on his side was spreading, darkening the water around him. "Listen to me, kid," O'Malley gasped, his voice weak. "You remember this. You remember what we did here today." "I will, Chief," Davy said, his voice cracking. "I promise." "It wasn't for nothing," O'Malley said, his eyes locking on Davy's. "They're safe. The flat tops, they got away. Because of us. Remember that." He gave Davy's arm a final, weak squeeze. Then, his grip loosened. His head dipped forward, and he slipped silently beneath the oily surface. Davy was alone. Alone in a sea of his shipmates, surrounded by the flotsam of his ship. He clung to the wreckage, the fuel oil burning his eyes. In the distance, he could see the Japanese fleet, a smudge on the horizon, turning away. The impossible had happened. Their suicide charge had worked. They had stopped the most powerful surface fleet in the world. He had lost everything. His ship. His captain. The chief who had become his anchor. But as he floated there, waiting for rescue that might never come, Ensign David Crockett, the boy from Iowa, was gone. In his place was an officer of the United States Navy. He had been to harm's way. And he had survived. The first strike. The Florida air in March of 1942 was thick and heavy, but the mood in the makeshift briefing room was charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the humidity. Captain James "Jimmy" Carter sat ramrod straight, his pilot's wings feeling newly minted and weightless on his chest. Around him, his B-25 Mitchell crew, co-pilot Leo Vance, engineer Frank Kowalski, bombardier Nick Russo, and gunner Tim "Abe" Abernathy, exchanged nervous, excited glances. They had been pulled from their regular training for something big. Something top secret. The door opened, and a silence fell so complete Jimmy could hear the buzz of a fly trapped against the windowpane. The man who walked in was shorter than his legend, but he carried an aura of absolute authority that filled the room. It was Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle. "Gentlemen," Doolittle began, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a routine training flight. "You've been wondering why you've been practicing short-field takeoffs with a full bomb load. The reason is simple. You are going to launch your B-25s from the deck of the USS Hornet." A stunned ripple went through the room. Launch a medium bomber from a carrier? It was impossible. The flight deck was far too short, Doolittle continued, laying out the plan with chilling clarity. They would sail across the Pacific, get as close to Japan as possible, bomb military targets in Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, and then fly on. Not back to the carrier, that was impossible. They would fly west, into the vastness of Asia, and hope to land in the parts of China not yet occupied by the Japanese. "It's a one-way mission," co-pilot Leo Vance, a man they called the Professor, for his quiet, analytical mind, whispered beside Jimmy. "The fuel calculations, they're a prayer, not a plan." Jimmy felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, but it was quickly burned away by a surge of fierce, defiant pride. This was it. This was the answer to the shock and humiliation of Pearl Harbor. This was the strike back. The training that followed was brutal and focused. They learned to get their 10-ton birds airborne in an impossibly short distance, to fly for hours just 50 feet above the waves, to conserve every drop of fuel. Sergeant Frank "Pops" Kowalski, their veteran flight engineer, became a man possessed, living in the bomber's engine nacelles, knowing that a single misfire over the ocean would mean death for his crew, most of whom were young enough to be his kids. Weeks later, under a shroud of secrecy, they boarded the USS Hornet in San Francisco. The sight was surreal. 16 massive B-25s, their wings overlapping, were lashed to the flight deck of the great carrier like captive eagles. As the Hornet slipped under the Golden Gate Bridge, a civilian on the span yelled, "You're going the wrong way." The crew just waved. They were heading into the heart of the enemy's domain. The voyage across the Pacific was a study in mounting tension. They attended endless briefings, studied their targets, and watched the ocean stretch on, a vast, gray emptiness. Then, on the morning of April 18th, when they were still hundreds of miles from their intended launch point, the ship's loudspeakers blared, "General Quarters. General Quarters. All hands to battle stations." They had been sighted by a Japanese patrol boat. The element of surprise was lost. Admiral Halsey's message from the flagship was terse and final: "Launch planes." To Col Doolittle and his gallant command, "Good luck and God bless you." It was time. The sea was a churning, 30-foot swell. The deck was pitching violently. This was worse than any scenario they had trained for. Jimmy Carter watched from his cockpit as Doolittle's plane, the first in line, revved its engines. The deck crew gave the final signal. Doolittle released his brakes. The B-25 roared down the deck, its left wheel hanging over the edge, and dropped sickeningly out of sight below the bow. For a heart-stopping second, Jimmy thought it was over. Then, the bomber emerged, climbing slowly, laboriously, into the leaden sky. It was possible. Now, it was his turn. The deck crew was waving frantically at him. It was time. Jimmy Carter took a deep breath, the smell of oil and saltwater filling his lungs. He looked at Leo Vance beside him, who gave a tight, grim nod. In the cockpit behind them, Pops Kowalski muttered a steady stream of prayers and profanities, his eyes glued to the engine gauges. "All set, Pops?" Jimmy asked, his voice surprisingly steady. "As she'll ever be, Captain," came the gruff reply. "Let's go give them hell." Jimmy pushed the twin throttles forward. The engines screamed in protest, the entire airframe shaking as if it would tear itself apart. He released the brakes. The B-25 shot forward, jolting violently over the seams in the deck. The end of the flight deck rushed towards them at a terrifying speed. He felt the wheels leave the deck, a moment of weightlessness, and then the stomach-lurching drop. They were falling towards the churning, gray waves. "Come on, baby, climb," Jimmy whispered, pulling back on the yoke with all his strength. For an eternity, they sank. The spray from the whitecaps seemed close enough to touch. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the altimeter began to creep upward. They were airborne. He banked the plane to the west, following the vague outline of Doolittle's bomber ahead. One by one, he saw the other B-25 struggle into the air behind him. 16 bombers, alone against an empire. The flight to Japan was a nerve-wracking trial of low-level flying. They skimmed just 50 feet above the waves, the propellers kicking up spray, to stay beneath Japanese radar. The professor, Leo Vance, navigated with a quiet intensity, his chart spread out before him. There was no room for error. After hours of this exhausting flight, a thin, green line appeared on the horizon. "Land ho," Vance said quietly. "Japan." Jimmy ordered the plane to climb. They needed altitude for the bombing run. As they rose, the coastline clarified into villages, roads, and then the sprawling, unmistakable urban landscape of Tokyo. Anti-aircraft fire at 12 o'clock. Abe, the gunner, yelled from his position. The sky around them began to dot with ugly, black puffs of smoke. Japanese fighters, sleek Zeros, scrambled from nearby fields, but they were too low and too fast for them to effectively intercept. They were flying right down the main street of the enemy capital. "Target in sight." Bombardier Nick Russo's voice came over the intercom, calm and focused. Bomb bay doors opening. Jimmy focused on keeping the plane steady, a perfect platform. The flak bursts rocked the aircraft. He could see the Imperial Palace grounds to his left, but their target was a factory complex ahead, bombs away. The plane leaped upward, suddenly several thousand pounds lighter. Jimmy banked sharply away, pushing the throttles forward. Behind them, a line of explosions walked through the industrial area. "That's for Pearl, you sons of bitches." Russo whooped, but the celebration was short-lived. The mission was only half over. Now, they faced the long, draining flight to China, their fuel gauges already dipping dangerously low. The sun began to set ahead of them, turning the vast expanse of the East China Sea into a foreboding, darkening plain. The real test was just beginning. Night fell, and with it, a storm. The B-25 was tossed around the sky like a leaf, flying blind through torrential rain and violent turbulence. There were no navigation aids, no friendly beacons. Leo Vance was navigating by dead reckoning, a skill of pure estimation and hope, trying to find a coastline in the blackness of occupied China. "Fuel state critical, Jimmy," Pops Kowalski reported, his voice stripped of its usual grit. "Port engine is starting to cough." Jimmy's knuckles were white on the controls. They had given everything. They had bombed Tokyo. But the sea below was a black pit, and the mountains of the Chinese coast were an invisible wall waiting to smash them to pieces. The port engine sputtered, caught, and then died with a final, gasping shudder. The plane yawed violently. A moment later, the starboard engine began to miss, its roar fading to a sickly whine. "We're not going to make it to the field," Vance said, his voice hollow. "We're not even going to make the coast." Jimmy Carter made the hardest decision of his life. "Prepare to bail out," he ordered, his voice cutting through the panic. "I'm going to try and get us as close to land as I can." He fought the dying plane, keeping it level just a little longer, praying for a glimpse of land. Suddenly, through the sheeting rain, a darker blackness materialized, jagged peaks. They were over the coast. Go! 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 He yelled. One by one, his crew tumbled out of the bomber and into the roaring darkness. Jimmy took one last look at the empty, shuddering cockpit, set the autopilot towards what he hoped was an unpopulated mountain, and jumped. The silence after the engine's roar was deafening. The wind ripped at his clothes, and then the parachute opened with a violent, reassuring jerk. He landed hard in a muddy, terraced field, his ankle exploding with pain. For a long time, he just lay there in the cold, pouring rain, listening to the silence. Then, in the distance, he heard the sound of his B-25 crashing into a mountainside. The final, dying breath of his ship. He was alone, injured, and behind enemy lines. As he tried to gather his bearings, he saw flashlights bobbing in the darkness down in the valley. Japanese patrols. The hunt had already begun. Crawling into a drainage ditch, he hid, shivering from cold and shock. He thought of his crew. Were they alive? Were they captured? The grand, symbolic victory of bombing Tokyo had shrunk to this, a personal, desperate struggle for survival in the mud. The mission was a success, but the cost was now being tallied in the darkness, one life at a time. Days blurred into a nightmare of hiding and moving by night. He was found not by the Japanese, but by Chinese guerrillas, who risked everything to smuggle him to safety. One by one, he was reunited with most of his crew. But not all. Some were captured by the Japanese. The fate of those men would be a tragedy that haunted Jimmy forever. He eventually made it back to the United States, a hero. But the man who returned was not the bright-eyed boy who had left. He had seen the face of the enemy, and he had felt the cold hand of mortality. The first strike had been launched. It had lifted a nation's spirit and changed the course of the war. But for Captain James Carter, the war was now personal. It was no longer about symbolism, it was about finishing what he had started, and ensuring the sacrifices of his crew were not in vain. History is not just a record of what happened, it's a warning, a lesson, and a tribute. We are committed to preserving this legacy, one story at a time. But we can't do it alone. If you want to see more stories like The Ghost of Gloucester, The Last Stand of the Tin Cans, and The First Strike, your support is crucial. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Together, we can keep history alive.